1 in 3 Australians are feeling lonely.
Now, technology, yes, it does connect us digitally, but at the same time, I think it's making us feel more alone.
If I look at the numbers around people who are feeling socially disconnected, it's alarming.
Because when you're young, this is when your mind is malleable. This is when you're meant to be out in the community, engaging with people.
Belonging is not just finding some friend, it's just finding acceptance of where you live, acceptance and safety.
If we look at social connection in a very simple equation, it's basically inclusivity plus visibility. And the issue with social disconnection is that it's like a spiral. And as soon as you're in it, it's very hard to get out. So being visible could even be just going on the street and having someone see you. They're maybe going to say hi. And that hi can maybe turn into small talk. And that small talk can maybe turn into a...
Before we dive into this conversation, please give me just 20 seconds. I know you've got hundreds of podcasts you could listen to, but any point during Unlayered, you paused and thought, that was me, or I felt that too. I'd love to ask a quick, simple favor. Please help me with a follow or subscribe to my channel, because that one click will not only help me bring more conversations to you, but for others who might need it. And it means the world for this work to continue. Thank you so much. Enjoy the conversation. Arjun, very warm welcome to Unlayered. I'm really excited to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
Let's dive into it. I think we got connected on LinkedIn, seeing a different conversation, and then I think you reached out to me. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
What I found really interesting about your mission of building, you're the founder of Social Threads, right? Which we are going to talk about in a bit in our conversation. But if I ask one question, what's one thing, if someone listened to our conversation today, at the end of it, what's one thing they will take away from our conversation?
I think one thing that they should take away is that the idea of social connection, it's very personal. Everyone has their own way of socially connecting. But if you have been empowered to think about social connection in a different light, then that is a very good takeaway you've had from this conversation.
Beautiful. And that's a great start. I feel people have a different conception based on the belief systems they have, the upbringing and the conditioning. So I hope that can give that out to someone to think in a different perspective from our conversation. Now, diving into the current landscape, I know that you asked not me to mention this word, but it's hard not to use the word loneliness. I think we are living in a very connected world. We can connect with anyone and everywhere using the digital media, and there's a lot of benefits in there. But if I look at the numbers around people who are feeling socially disconnected, is alarming. So just to highlight a few, 1 in 3 Australians are feeling lonely. And quite interestingly, people who are in the age between 15 to 24 are feeling even lonelier. And that's, I find, very fascinating and curious about to why. Whereas we tend to think it's more the elder population. With your experience now building social threads, and also with your previous background being a social worker, what do you think is the reason for this?
I think that loneliness is one of those things that we can't really pinpoint, but we can see there are probably different factors. For example, collectivist countries, we see that generally there tends to be less loneliness because there's more camaraderie, there's more kinship, there's more community. In individualistic societies, we see that generally there's higher stats of loneliness and social disconnection. One more thing is we're seeing that younger people, obviously, when you and I were kids, I'm sure you remember the loneliest people were the older people.
Yes.
People in old age homes, people 70s, 80s, retired. Makes sense. Now we're seeing, and you rightly pointed out, the loneliest people now are younger. This is very sad, very concerning, and quite alarming. Because when you're young, this is when your mind is malleable. This is when you're meant to be out in the community, engaging with people. You're meant to be involved. Your hands are meant to be busy doing things. And I think part of this is maybe that we're in an individualistic society increasingly, and also technology. Now, technology, yes, it does connect us digitally, but at the same time, I think it's making us feel more alone than ever because we're not leveraging it in the right way. I think a digital world is great for filling the gaps for maybe people who are distant from education or knowledge. You have access to ordering things at your fingertips. But at the same time, I think it's quietly making loneliness and social disconnection worse because more people are comfortable sitting behind their screens and they don't know how to socialize.
I loved how you broke it down, Arjun. And then I wanted to like take those as like branches of trees and then maybe a deep dive into it. So first thing you mentioned is like, I think if you look at the context of Australia, we call it as an individualistic country. So I understand from my work, I live in Australia and I work with a lot of migrants. And I face this challenge of when they migrate, definitely the expectations don't align with what they perceive as like making it abroad. And then they start to feel this disconnection socially. And because they're used to, I mean, in simple terms, the we becomes I. You might find freedom, but you lose the mirror in a way. And that has different components to it, in my view. For an example, it could be the part of belonging, which is like belonging is not just finding some friend, it's just finding acceptance of where you live, acceptance and safety, in my view. Why do you think that? I think you work with a lot of people in these communities who might be part of migrants and other communities as well. What is your experience with migrants feeling this challenge in belonging to a place and how that has a connection in social isolation or disconnection?
Well, if we're going to break it down into the groups that are most socially disconnected, we would see that unfortunately loneliness is pervasive in Australia, and we see that it's actually one of the loneliest countries in the world. So yes, it's we have Medicare, we have a great socialist system, but at the same time, if the people are not connected to the community and a sense of belonging, this is a very big problem. When we're looking at the three most lonely groups in Australia, one is international students.
Okay.
Second, migrants. Third, older people. Now, when we're looking at migrants, they are quite vulnerable to social disconnection because one thing is the cultural misunderstandings, maybe the cultural clash. When you're not connecting with your host country culturally, it's hard to assimilate, right? And because of that, you feel further disconnected. It creates a further wall to your professional belonging, to your personal belonging, social belonging, emotional, all those things. On top of that, there's a language barrier. A lot of the people that come from overseas, especially a lot of them are Chinese background, South Asian background, Vietnamese, and in a lot of these countries, English is not spoken. So if you don't have professional proficiency of the language, it's very hard to connect with the local population. This creates a further divide and can create a greater sense of isolation. So these are the main components for why migrants can find it especially hard to assimilate and to find a sense of belonging in Australia.
I think I haven't done this before. Let's visualize like maybe one person. Like I want to also see for us to visualize one person going through this journey and then see how we can foster a platform or channel for them to see that there is always a channel or maybe a door for them to have this gap or this disconnection a little bit less, right? So let's say someone coming from China to Australia as a migrant. So growing up, they have different sets of values, belief systems. Let's say they grew up until age 20, 25. Different system, the culture, religious or non-religious beliefs, and language. Now they come to Australia to study, or maybe let's say for a working visa as a migrant, and then you feel immediately disconnected from the system that you face in Australia. How do you approach it if you are someone like that, Arjun? I'm sure you're a migrant, right? Like all of a sudden to get all these barriers for you, it could be so challenging. Sometimes someone might listen to this and say like it's easier for us to discuss, but it's really difficult to face everything at once: language, culture, spiritual disconnection, and everything else just falling apart, and you feel like you have to build everything from ground up. How would you approach this if we are this one person who's just migrated and then you're facing this?
When there's an amalgamation of factors, like you're saying, a spiritual disconnection, cultural, language, it becomes very, very difficult. I am a migrant, yes, but at the same time, I would say that I come from a privileged position. And the reason is because I grew up in many countries. I was born and raised in the Middle East. I grew up in South Pacific, in Africa. So because of this made me very adaptable. And when you're adaptable, you're able to mold yourself to your environment. such that you can be more socially cohesive with the community you're in. On top of that, I went to international schools, so I'm very used to mixing with culturally diverse backgrounds.
Okay.
And add to that the fact that I'm competent in English. English is my first language. So because of this, it made adjustment easier. However, being a migrant, there's still difficulties, and I experienced that. So if you compound that, what I experienced, that social disconnection with someone who has cultural misunderstandings, who has a language barrier, who has a spiritual disconnection, you can imagine that their sense of isolation from the community of the host country they're in is probably tenfold. I would say that one of the best things they can do is probably develop their English language skills. This is the best way to actually assimilate as well as possible in the host country. But at the same time, we're seeing that in different pockets of Melbourne, we see this, right? Springville has a higher Vietnamese population. Maybe Coburg has a higher Lebanese or Turkish population. We're seeing in Box Hill, it's more Chinese. Clayton is more Indian. So we see that immigrants naturally flock towards where there's a greater sense of belonging. And we're seeing that generally birds of a feather flock together. And we're seeing this basic human psychology play out in our suburbs. So there is a sense of belonging. Naturally, we do see that migrants do feel more socially connected in Australia as time progresses, but they tend to feel more socially connected with their own type, with their own ethnicity, with their own group. In terms of how generally migrants tend to feel more connected with the local population, that we're seeing that generally it picks up when they have greater proficiency of the English language.
I think that's a great analogy, and I love the fact that how you explain. I mean, I can relate to it, especially in the earlier days of me migrating to this country. I was also like when I had to find my first rental place, the shared rental place. I found another Sri Lankan, right? Like never in my life I thought, okay, I'll just go out there and then find anything. And that immediate, I would say, the connection or the biases that we have, that we might feel safer in an environment where it's known for us, similarity, right? But when I found my first job, then it presented different challenges. The disconnection was presenting, like to me, okay, you've been living here for 6 months, but still you feel like a bit disconnected from the rest of like other Australians when I was like, because I had no other option other than just going to work. So again, building the language proficiency is for a migrant, someone who's coming from a non-native English-speaking background, is such a great tip. I'm sure someone like you, as you say, might be privileged, not privileged, but were in a different environment where you had English speaking proficiency brought up like from a very young age. But for someone else, that could help you bridge the gap a bit and then feel a little bit of safety around when you start your life in a whole different country.
You were talking about, just to add to your point, you were talking about how when you first moved to Australia, you linked up with a Sri Lankan person, right? And we're also seeing the same with jobs. As you know, in Australia, there's a hidden job market, right? Where many things are just word of mouth. It's who you
Yeah.
know, especially for blue collared stuff, right? Maybe less for white collared. And I have a Mexican friend who came on a holiday visa, I believe.
Yeah.
And I asked her, "Where did you find your job?" And she said, "Oh, there's a Mexican WhatsApp group where they advertise." Then I asked someone else who is Italian, "Oh, yeah, there's an Italian Telegram group for jobs." So a lot of these jobs are also where they're hiring people from their own ethnic background, their own linguistic background. So we're seeing the same even with job hiring, right? You want a sense of relatability. And naturally, we're also seeing the same with migrants, right? They feel lonely, but they're assimilating within their pockets or their clusters in suburbs.
Mhm.
But this does not necessarily fit that mold for belonging. Because normally belonging comes also when you are assimilating in the culture of your host country. And like we're saying, this is generally improved when the linguistic or the language barrier is addressed.
I 100% agree, because the idea of our conversation is to break down with someone if someone is overwhelmed with like their journey and facing all these things all at once, and that's where it can build up into a maybe a bit of a worse situation, possibly causing illnesses or mental health conditions, right? So it's good that we address the language barrier, but I 100% agree with you, Arjun. It's the belongingness. It's not just about finding your own community, someone who you can relate to, and just then end up in that environment, I find that again, it just takes me back to everyone I work with. Like, you're finding a job in your community, okay, you're picking up a few like classes to improve your English, but still there's this sense of disconnect, because the country that you're living in has a different value system. For an example, when you go out on weekends, what you see is quite different to what you've experienced all your life. The belief systems around how you spend holidays, what you do in a family system is quite different.
I would say that, yes, that is very true, and a sense of belonging is very personal. At the same time, I think it's important for migrants to maybe mingle with other migrants. It is easier for a migrant to mingle with other migrants, obviously from the same ethnic background, but also it's fairly easy for them to mix with migrants from other ethnic backgrounds than it is to mingle with people, locals, right? Because there's a sense of shared experience. So when migrants kind of share their experience with maybe people from other cultural backgrounds, they will kind of feel less lonely because there's a sense of relatability. When other people are sharing their experiences, then it kind of normalizes things and you feel less alone. Someone is there to hold your hand in the dark because you're both experiencing the same shit. Sorry, you're both experiencing the same thing. Like they say, when your happiness shared with someone is happiness multiplied, and then despair, grief, sadness, all these negative emotions shared with someone is divided. So when you're sharing that sense of relatability, it helps. At the same time, I want to also add to the fact that it's important to be cognizant of the cultural cues in your host country. And this comes with time. But I also think that it comes by kind of tapping into other people's experiences and kind of asking what were some cultural, maybe, barriers that you face, so that when you experience them, nothing catches you off guard. I remember in my instance in university, I had a professor who I really liked. And when we're talking about that social disconnection, it kind of ties into cultural disconnection because I remember giving her a gift. And I liked her very much. And she opened it immediately. And she said, "Wow, this is so lovely. This is incredible, Arjun. That is so thoughtful of you." Immediately, I felt socially disconnected from her. And I'll tell you why. Because
Mhm.
this links back to a cultural root of disconnection. In Australian culture, you receive a gift. What's very common in the gift giving culture and receiving culture is you normally open it, right? Because in Australian culture, they love to see your reaction. When you show someone's reaction to a gift, that is part and parcel of the gift giving and receiving kind of pattern, right? In my culture, in South Asian culture, and often in the culture I grew up in, when you receive a gift, you don't open it in front of the person. You put it on the side, you say thank you, and then you continue with your pleasantries, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Because in our culture, normally this means that, hey, the gift is really appreciated, but let me put it on the side because you matter more to me than the gift is. Right. So when she kind of opened the gift in front of me, I thought, wow, this is incredibly rude. I feel completely sidelined. And that made me feel more socially isolated. So I feel like at the same time, a lot of the social isolation stems from our lack of cultural understanding. But the more we try and all understand the culture of the host nation, the more we'll feel by default a little more socially connected to the people around us.
I love that example. And firsthand, like, I've experienced that many, many times. And now I feel like on the other side, right? If I give a gift to someone and if they don't open it in front of me, I feel disconnected, right? This is me talking about after 10 years. Like, there's a profound lesson beneath what you just shared. I think we carry our identities, and I wanted to tap into that, like the part of identity. Like, I know understanding culture is one thing. One can go and search so much. That is important to understand what cultural values are, understanding how they operate in the country you choose to live in. That gives you a sense of understanding, okay, at least awareness. But I still think there's deeper work required in oneself to understand, to be aware of what's important to you in the value system that you were brought up in. For an example, one value that I carry that I perceive as good or bad, we assign labels, right, for everything. So that is attached to my conditioning, the childhood, and what I perceive as good as bad. For an example, if one thing I got really disconnected with in the earlier days is when we go into like a catch up coffee or hang out with someone. If I invite someone, I would pay for it. All right. I would probably go and pay. And usually in Sri Lanka, people used to fight for it. And then that's the sense of shared energy. Okay, I'm gonna fight and pay the bill. And I started hanging out here with my first Australian friend, right? This guy invited me for his birthday. And then I said, okay, I'll go and enjoy a nice meal, and it's his treat. And we walk up to the counter, and then, yeah, you want to get your check? And then I did end up paying, but then it took me a week or so to reflect what just happened. And that's another example. But jokes aside, Arjun, both the examples are quite, I think, resonant with migrants, I'm sure. But underneath it, what's the lesson behind for you to think beyond the values that you carry and see how you can adapt, like beyond your identity that you carry? That's what I want to ask you, because we all carry identities, right? And sometimes we put those values into a box and say, this is me. Anything about this box, I wouldn't just like agree or align with it. I don't think it's necessarily possible for you to think that box won't change, especially after you take a decision of like big decision like migration, or that can be applied to any other context, like getting into a marriage, relationship, becoming a parent. That box will change. What's your advice on that, especially tapping into that part of identity?
I think what you're saying is very correct. You cannot really compartmentalize your values, right? Because just like purpose, it will oscillate. Your purpose will change. It can take a 180. It can drop completely. Sometimes no purpose in itself is a purpose because you're just being pure consciousness, as someone like 𝗬𝗏𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃, the famous spiritual author, would say, right? So in the same way, values will also be fluid. Values will also oscillate. So especially if you're a migrant, you need to be prepared for your values to change. And your values will probably mold in accordance with the society you're in. But you can still get a sense of belonging by, these are two important things you need to do in order to be socially connected. And I think if you kind of label social connection in a very simple equation, it's very easy for you to work on your social connection. Like we're saying, social connection is very personal, but it's very easy for you to identify things from the ground up. If we look at social connection in a very simple equation, it's basically inclusivity plus visibility. Everything around inclusivity and everything around visibility, that's personal for you. But if you kind of label it in these two structures, whatever values you have that also change and are fluid, as long as we allow it to be fluid, they will be fluid in line with inclusivity and visibility. And if you see a lot of the social connection we have on a day-to-day basis, whether it's familial, whether it's personal, whether it's professional, the root is always some form of visibility or some form of inclusivity. So it's just that reframing.
That's very like a fresh perspective for me to understand, like still acknowledging that everything is fluid around us, not compartmentalizing the value system that like all these system believes you bring in, but trying to be aware of, if you can recap, it's inclusivity and
Visibility. So just to kind of add on that, because I think this might help someone. Let's say someone is feeling a bit socially disconnected. And oftentimes you see that people who are feeling socially disconnected are a bit aloof. And the issue with social disconnection is that it's like a spiral. And as soon as you're in it, it's very hard to get out. But one way to break it is by being visible. So being visible could even be just going on the street and having someone see you. Because likelihood is when you're going on the street and walking, someone's going to maybe acknowledge you. They're maybe going to say hi. And that hi can maybe turn into small talk. And that small talk can maybe turn into a friendship. Visibility could also mean, if you're a little bit more outgoing, is being on the tram. Being on the tram and saying hi to someone. I'm someone who's extroverted, so oftentimes a lot of the friendships that I've had has been from being visible on a tram, on a bus, at a train stop, starting a conversation. And inclusivity is the reciprocal. If someone is maybe saying hi to me, then I will acknowledge with a hi back. Another part about being visible is something as simple as maybe you go on hikes, Pan. You go on hikes. I want to be included. So for me to actually make myself visible would be as simple as saying, hey, Pam, I saw some of your hiking pictures on Instagram. Tell me more about it. Now, I'm in no way saying, invite me. I'm in no way saying I have no friends. I'm in no way saying I'm socially disconnected. I'm just planting a seed of intention by being visible. And you, in return, you're reciprocating with inclusivity, because next time you go on a hike, likelihood is you might think about it. You might consider it. That's the social connectedness equation.
That's brilliant, because it takes away the whole guilt or the shame part of someone being like perceived as alone, right? I think especially when it comes to men, that is a big factor. even though you feel it, you don't want to be exposed as that you're actually taking an effort, or you wanted to make friends, or you don't want to perceive that I'm getting like auto invited to your hike because I need to get out and do something and I want to make a friend, and then you don't set that intention anyway. It just breaks that whole weightage. I think it's not only meant for others as well. If you like, I think follow that equation. Where does sorry.
I would like to add, because you self-corrected, and I'd say the same. It's not just for men; it's for human beings.
Yeah.
Right. And this ties into the collaborative workshops I have for social threads. When I'm advertising it, I will never say for people who don't have friends or for people who are lonely. If you tell me I'm lonely, I will say, nah, that's not me. Nah. But if you make it and you reframe it in a more empowering way, such as let's make a social toolkit together that we can use to create lasting connections in the community, it's more empowering. And people will say, okay, that sounds more like me. You'll know that the hidden message is that I need to make friends. But instead of that, it's actually you're using more euphemistic language. That's more inclusive, more empowering, and more collaborative, right? And when we're talking about men, we're seeing that for men, it's especially hard because men don't like the idea of being lonely. They don't like the idea of saying or labeling themselves as someone who doesn't have friends. Because if even the environment is not conducive to social interaction, the men tend to always self-blame and think that this is because of me. It's because of my problems. It's because no one likes me. But oftentimes we need to reframe and say that maybe we're in an individualistic society. And maybe this is making it a little bit harder for men to socialize. One more thing, we're seeing something called the male loneliness epidemic, right? And we're seeing that the loneliest people now are men, young men. Young men are lonely. And the reason is, if we kind of break it down, it's very simple. Men create friendships over bonding activities, not over literally sitting front to front with each other and having a coffee, but actually through doing something, through doing stuff like fishing, through doing bowling, through doing sports. Now we're seeing all of these middle bridging activities. For some reason, they're no longer existing. And because of this, there are no opportunities for men to actually collaborate and form friendships in the process. That's the reason men's sheds are so impactful, because men are actually bonding over carpentry. But actually, the hidden message behind it is for friendship. So we need to bring in more activities where men can form friendships. If you're forming a table for men to sit and just make friends, it's probably not going to be effective. But if you're talking about an actual activity and the byproduct of it is friendship, we can probably play a greater role in actually addressing the male loneliness epidemic, in my opinion.
And that's a very valid, timely point that you just addressed, because I think I don't have the numbers in Australia, but in US, I think I recently heard 1 in 4 men don't have a best friend. 1 in 7 men don't have any single friend. And that's alarming as it can get. As you said, if you just frame an activity or a group saying, come and find friends, I think men will not really take. I mean, I'm telling from my personal experience, it's easier for us to say be aware and then break all your conditioning, but it's not that straightforward or easy. Sometimes you need to find the middle ground. Okay, if science research says that men want more activities, then how do we find more activities? And then after that, the friendship can be a byproduct of it.
Exactly. Right. So we need more. We need to continue to bring in those activities. I don't know how, but we need to create a space for men to have those activities, like men's shirts, where a byproduct of it can be a sense of kinship, belonging, friendship. But for men to just come and just say, okay, this is a group to make friends, it's not going to be effective, because no one wants to be labeled as a person with no friends. But you want to be labeled as the person who does these hobbies. And as a result of that, is able to have friendships that you can relate to, which is why social hiking these days is so beneficial for making friends. And the reason is because you're starting on a common foundation of people who enjoy nature, who enjoy socializing, who enjoy hiking. So you're already starting on a foundation with 3 common things. And the more things you have in common as a starting foundation, the more likelihood it is to actually reach, and we're talking about Unlayered, a deeper layer of friendship or connection or belonging.
Curious to see, like hear from you, Arjun, especially since we are talking about men. The digital age has, I think, a huge impact in men more than women, especially the younger group of men who are in the age of 15 to 24. You had a bit of experience working as a social worker. I'm not sure whether they fall into this category, but especially if you said like if someone is interested in nature and finding a hike or another activity that you can go out and do like something with another group of men, but you're all glued to the phone and you're consuming. And I feel like it's set out the current content landscape in a way for you to be glued to the phone.
Of course, of
Right.
course.
That's the objective. That's the objective, right? And
There's nothing alarming there. Like the more seconds that you spend on the phone, the more profitable it is for any company, right? So they're working in the best interest for you to keep scrolling. As simple as that. Every second that you are spending scrolling is every second better for them, right? And bear in mind that you are one man who's on the phone, but at the back end, you're going against thousands of the smartest people whose whole job and motive it is to optimize every single part of your brain, every single happy chemical for it to actually be energized so that you can stay on. So you are kind of fighting an uphill battle. But if you're aware of it, that social media, the companies are not there in your best interest, I think that's half of the battle.
what type of strategies, practical things for someone who's really attached to the phone? And I think it slowly takes our conversations into a bit of a deeper area. Like I think you help people, men especially, has encountered like violence. I think violence, domestic violence, right? That is again an effect of possibly sets of all these things contributing to younger men or older men, especially what we are seeing after COVID, right? So if someone has experienced or has been part of, because we talk about men being violent a lot nowadays, but we don't talk about the silence behind it, or actually what is the root cause or what are the layers beneath that violence. Because for men, I feel there's no vocabulary for sadness. There's just no portal channel to express it, and it's being framed as a weakness, and that itself comes out as violence, aggression, hate, enragement. What's your experience with that, and what have you done in your line of work to help out?
So most recently, I was working as a social worker in domestic violence. So I was working with men who were using violence in their relationships. What we see about domestic violence is that it's highly gendered in nature. 95% roughly of the domestic violence cases, the people using violence are men. But obviously, it's important to uncover why this is happening. I used to think that it was maybe a certain immigrant group or ethnicity, anything but that. We had CEOs using violence, we had the poor people using violence, we had all races, all ethnicities, all cultures, all faiths using violence. One thing that we saw in common with all these men using violence, however, was that there was some form of childhood trauma. These behaviors were very normalized. They maybe saw their father doing this type of thing to their mother, and they now normalize this behavior and they do it in their own families, which is why we see a lot of it is intergenerational. Someone needs to break the cycle. But I think a strong protective factor for actually recovering and having some sense of insight. The most important thing is for a man to have a sense of insight that this is wrong. Because once there's a sense of insight, then change can occur. Change cannot occur without insight, right? So for a lot of these men to have insight, I think what's important is strong social belonging. Not just to families, but to friendships. And these should be friends where they're actually impactful. You're actually able to debrief with them. You're actually able to have deep and meaningful conversations with them. With less men having closer friendships, and like you rightly pointed out, we're seeing today the men are lonelier than ever before. Fewer men have a close friend than ever before in history. And now that we're seeing that this protective factor of close friendship is going out the window, the idea of these people using violence and having them have insight, it's a little harder for them now because they no longer have these strong protective factors of belonging. And we're seeing that a lot of the men who use violence tend to have no friends at all. And
Wow.
social disconnection can be a risk factor for people who are using violence, which is not surprising, actually. I want to also tap into the biological aspect. In our brains, we have a lot of chemicals, mainly oxytocin, responsible for social interaction. When we hug dogs, when there's a sense of belonging, camaraderie, trust, friendship, normally oxytocin is released. And this is basically nature's way of begging us to actually look out for one another, right? So it's there for a reason. So if this is there for a reason, we obviously can tell why it's so important for us to have a sense of social connection and why, when we don't have it, we feel sad. Very simply put, when we have greater social connection, we're happier. When we have less of it, we're sadder. And this is no other simpler way than to explain from our biological mechanism within us.
And I love that you put it in a very simpler way. And sometimes that's also a part of social media. We try to find all the magical formulas to overcome it, the issues, the challenges we face. But if you try to simplify it and how we've evolved biologically, it's just that connectedness, how the brain's chemical works, oxytocin, and then just leveraging that could be one simple act that you can think of in terms of moving the needle from your current space, right? I know you talked about being an extrovert. I want to pick on that because someone might be listening, right? Moving on to the social threads, someone might say, "Hey, Arjun, it's nice that you had like different experience in different countries, exposure to different cultures, and you're an extrovert by nature, so you can initiate things and just go out freely, meet friends, talk to strangers, say hi." I'm not like that. I'm an introvert. I don't feel safe telling hi to people when I go out on the road. I've been raised by this. I had possibly, I'm not just talking about people who have gone through traumatic experiences, like in just to make it out clear, that needs healing, that the person has to go on like understanding why it happened, and then that's totally different thing. We are not touching on that. This is just we attach ourselves labels, right? Extrovert, introvert, and we say our energies are more aligned when you're in more one-on-one conversations, not in a group setting. Like I don't, feel comfortable going out and talking to strangers or introducing yourself, whereas extroverts the other side. What would you say to this idea of introvert extrovert? I think that's, for me, I find it very curious. Like we somehow operate with those labels and then frame our behaviors, actions, thought process, even what we consume based on that. So more we put energy into that label or the tag, more we perceive our life in that. It's just as that profound saying, we see the world as we are.
Of course.
Not the way it is. Maybe you're not an introvert. Like that's what I thought. I still feel that I try to not look at myself with a label. I try to look at myself in, okay, every day, sometimes I peel a layer off, or maybe I wear another new layer every day. And I accept that I keep changing instead of saying that this is me. What is your take on that, Arjun?
Like we're saying, reality is neutral, right? Reality is neutral. It doesn't have feelings. It doesn't care about anything. What really matters is the way we perceive things around us, right? Now, when we're talking about introvert, extrovert, I think that also oscillates. Someone who's more introverted can at times be extroverted. And the whole goal of my project, Social Threads, is that I noticed that a lot of people did not know where to make friends. They did not know how to make friends. So I'm touching on something that's quite surface level on the idea of social disconnection. If you're saying that I'm going through some internal instability and I don't know how to interact because it brings out these emotions, maybe that's a little bit beyond what I can do. Maybe that needs a counselor or a professional therapist. I'm not trying to get to the deeper stuff. I'm trying to get to the surface level stuff of how we can be more socially connected. When I came to Australia for a couple of years, I did not know how to make friends. And I kept thinking it was because of me. But the reality was that I did not have the tools and the resources to make friends because I did not know where to make friends. I did not know how to make friends. So we need to create a safe space where people can talk about the idea of social cohesion. Because when we're kind of throwing ideas around and we're having this safe space where there's no right or wrong, people are going to have light bulb moments. And when you have light bulb moments, then the idea of being socially disconnected is destigmatized. And on top of that, you're sharing ideas, and in the process of sharing ideas, there's more collaboration, more friendship, but more importantly, in the process of being in that workshop, not only are you having light bulb moments, but you're also leaving with tools that you can use in the community. And when you're exchanging ideas, you're also having a shared sense of belonging. This can pave the way for friendship. But more important than that, I don't just want workshops where people are forming friendships. That's great. But a byproduct of those workshops that would be that people have the skills, tools, and resources to leave. Maybe even one tool, one resource to leave, such that when they're on their own, they can continue to make lasting connections to the community. It's as simple as that. And the reason it's simple is because I believe that with grassroots solution, it kind of needs to be simple. And the reason is because it needs to be inviting. People need to think that, okay, I just want to attend a 1 hour collaborative discussion and leave with maybe one takeaway. And that maybe is enough for them. Maybe some people, they'll need 10 takeaways. But the whole idea is that you're creating a safe space. And the reason, one more thing, I believe that community level initiatives can be very, very impactful, especially for things like social disconnection. Legislation, acts, government policies, they're too far removed from the problem. And when you're so far removed from the problem, you don't actually have insight to what's happening on the ground. And on top of that, people are falling through the cracks. But people like us, maybe migrants who actually relate to things, because we have a shared experience, we're trying to make sure that no one's falling through the gaps. And when we're talking to people one-on-one, we're kind of seeing what worked, what didn't. So it's an iterative process. And we're fine-tuning things a little bit. If we're talking about one's personal experience with belonging, this is a little bit more personal, and this is less about social cohesion and more about a personal, maybe something where a therapist could maybe help one-on-one. The sense of, oh, I don't know about these emotions that are coming out. But if we're just talking about empowering people simply with the tools and skills and resources to connect, I think this can do maybe one small thing to create a more socially cohesive or connected society. Now, if we're looking at the layers, maybe that's a little bit hard for social threats to do at this time. But the whole idea is, let's talk about social connection. Let's have some light bulb moments. Let's make a basic social toolkit that we can implement in our own personal day-to-day lives. We'll see as we go along with this project, but mine is quite surface level, and I think that's needed.
It is 100% needed. I would love that solution for me to get out of my house and just get one takeaway. It's just one thing. I'm sure there's a lot of people who still get a lot of value in the surface level social connection. And I 100% agree with you. There are different layers to loneliness and making friends or all that. But if no one is taking action into at least addressing some surface level thing, we will be as you said. That's why the importance of grassroots activities, so that it's a community grounded up, from bottom up approach. It's more helpful to skip all these fundamental systemic changes, and we just keep on talking about it. Might take ages to fix.
And look, this is a prime example. We've had a full discussion so far about social connection. I've in no way given you any solutions because I have no authority to give you any solutions, and I'm no expert here. But I'm sure you must have had some light bulb moments because of this discussion that you will now maybe consider in your own personal life to create lasting connections, right? Just
100%.
because we've had a discussion.
100%. 100%.
That's
the whole goal. And I think that's a big takeaway for someone listening. You don't need to be proficient in a tool or a software or a way or a competency, soft skill for you to be making a social connection or a friend. Sometimes it's just putting yourself out there, having a conversation and see how it goes, right? So I want to dive into a bit of the workshops that you do, if you're open to share. I think based on your experience so far, how does the workshops run and what's it like for someone to attend a workshop of yours?
So I've been doing them for free at community centers, old age homes, and places where I feel like people would benefit. But the whole idea is that it's very simple and very collaborative. It's less of me talking, but more of me just guiding a facilitated discussion. There's a small worksheet, and the worksheet maybe has 20 words on it. And big blank spaces. If you want to write on it, write. If you don't want to, don't. If you want to burn it, burn it. And the whole idea of even that worksheet is that social connection is personal. Your understanding of social connection is personal. It's different to my idea of social connection. But if you're having a light bulb moment with the worksheet, great. If you're having it without the worksheet, great. If you're having it through a collaborative discussion, great. But the whole idea is that there is no right or wrong. Once again, there's no right or wrong. But I am just trying to guide the discussion. So there's a bit of a framework. And when you leave the discussion, you leave the workshop, you can think of social connection through a bit of a framework and build your idea of social connection from your own personal life, from your environment, from the ground up, using a framework. As simple as that.
That's awesome. I would encourage anyone, I would personally come to a workshop and experience that myself, Arjun, and I really love what you're building as well. I find this thought always pops up on my mind. I think I wanted to ask you just before we wrap up our conversation. We have this idea of making a friend. Would you rather, in the most simplest way, would advise someone to make a friend or have an intention to be a friend?
That's a very, very good question. I would say the priority would be to at least strive to emulate to be the person that you'd want to be friends with, right? If there's someone who greatly inspires you, maybe sit down tonight in your journal and write about all the things that make them so inspiring to you and see what values you have that don't align or maybe align with them and how you can bridge that. And if you try and bridge that gap, maybe you'll see that you'll be a little bit more magnetic to the people that you actually want to be around. So I think that instead of trying to find friends, I think the right friends will gravitate towards you if you try and, one, make yourself visible, and two, try to be inclusive. But at the same time, try and work in accordance with the values that you hold true to yourself. And like we're saying, there's no right or wrong. Whatever values you hold true for yourself, if you strive to emulate them, you'll have the right people coming to you. Then you won't need to make friends. A byproduct of that will be the friends come to you.
That's a really beautiful answer. And I think that takeaway itself will be so helpful for someone who's afraid to get out and making this effort, who's been procrastinating or maybe overthinking a bit. Just to have this simple idea of staying true to your values, and instead of having too much pressure to make a friend. Like I find this because in myself as well, I was there going to meetups after meetups, but this whole weightage of making a friend as a goal. Like if I don't make a friend in one meetup or have a continuous conversation, that's a failure. Whereas I thinking, okay, like how can people approach it differently without attaching yourself to a bigger outcome in every conversation? Sometimes you can have what, like they can implement the same thing you just mentioned, right? Being visible and inclusivity when you go out, take your coffee next day, tomorrow. And I think that will be something that anyone can take away from our conversation.
And I think it's important to also emphasize that even though I do these workshops, I'm in no way an expert. Because each time I facilitate the workshops, I'm learning about social connection or maybe looking at it through a different angle. And each time I'm looking at it through a different angle, I'm learning something myself. So I'm in no way an expert on this. I think anyone who knows about social connection knows that it's fluid. And if you keep your expectations of social connection fluid, I think that you'll be able to mold yourself to different environments and social situations in line with your values, but also keep your expectations fluid. We also see with a lot of friendships, because we evolve, our friendships evolve. And because other people evolve, sometimes people grow apart. But you don't grow apart, you don't grow distant, you just grow in different directions. And that's also fine. And when you actually know that you don't have expectations of other people, your idea of social connection will also maybe become deeper because you will respect the people who have grown in a different direction from you. And there's no bad or good growth. You're just growing in different directions. And sometimes that means that friendships maybe misalign, but that's fine because then you'll find friendships that align more with your current state until it evolves a different way.
Can you relate to that in your own journey? Like, I think I can relate to it so much. Like, me growing apart with friends that I grew up with, maybe from the school, where it was initially quite difficult, where it's not the same wavelength when we have a conversation and we've grown apart. I think that can be applicable for relationships as well. But it's just having an understanding and the nature of fluidity, change, but not labeling it or judging it as good or bad.
Of course. And this is the most human experience. You'll have friends, and the worst thing is when we have expectations and you meet them after a long time and you think, wait, why aren't we the same? Because you've grown and they've grown. And there's nothing good or bad. Because you've grown, you've had more friends that now suit your current circumstances. And they also have the same. So as long as we're remaining fluid with our expectations as well, with our idea of social connection, with our values, we're all happy.
I think there's a one profound lesson underneath what you're saying is the nature of impermanence. And people have a negative connotation when you hear impermanence, but I think fluidity might be a better word to address it, right? Fluidity around expectations, fluidity around your purpose, fluidity around friendships, social connection, and having to look at that fluidity in a more accepting way.
That's in line with a very core concept of Buddhism. So people raised in those values would maybe be able to align with that concept.
I'm sure the others might be able to see it in that way as well if you reflect on your own life. Arjun, this has been such a very nice conversation where we talked about so many aspects of social connection, not only social connection, like I think simple frameworks, simple things in surface level that anyone can take onto their life and implement with not much of expertise, right? We talked about so many things, and I think thoroughly I enjoyed this conversation a lot. Before wrapping up our conversation, we have this routine of me asking just one question from every guest. And if I may ask you, with your permission, that would be what's one thing you have unlearned in your life? It could be unlearned or unlayered. So, one thing you unlearned.
Probably that this moment is all that I will ever have, and past and future is a complete construct of the mind. So the more we live in awareness of the only thing that we have, which is now, and the less resistance we have to the now, I think the more happy we'll be or satisfied we'll be with our situation.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you so much, Pan, for having me. And one more thing I want to add is that for anyone interested in social threads, you can see the page on LinkedIn. And currently, I'm on a series which is to actually get 1,000 strangers sharing 1,000 tips on how they made friends. And you can also find upcoming workshops on Facebook for social threads and also the Meetup app. So if you're interested, come along. There's no right or wrong. And maybe just think about social connection in a different way. Maybe make one or two friends in the process and take on some tools or resources that you can carry on to your personal life to create some more lasting connections.
I'm pretty sure after our conversation, a lot of people will be like signing up and then understanding the value, because this conversation itself made me feel at ease and having a conversation with another one, like a human being. I will pop in the description of this conversation as well, all your links, Arjun, for anyone who wants to connect with you as well. And that idea of thousand, like, can you reframe that? What's
So that's just 1,000 strangers.
1,000 strangers?
1,000 strangers sharing their own way in maybe 10 seconds, 5 or 10 or 15 seconds, very short way that they made a friend, one way they made a friend. So anyone who sees it, maybe if they see it, they'll get inspired and maybe try that way out.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm going to go and check out. And for someone who feels like, I don't want to make a big commitment, time might be a few seconds to say how you made a friend. And let's see, someone who follows that journey might find different ways other people have how they found friends. Right?
I've already done about 150 people, and quite a few of them are very simple ways, like just complimenting what someone is wearing. And that actually evolved into a wonderful friendship.
Wow. Go and check out. I will definitely check out. Arjun, thanks for the beautiful work that you're doing. It's very much needed in this time of age, and this is a service that you're doing. So I'm really grateful that I cross path with you, and hopefully I have many conversations with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ben, for having me.